The night in Lyon was cold, bitterly cold, as if the city itself had turned its back on those who wandered its ancient streets with nowhere to go. The grandeur of Lyon, known for its Renaissance architecture and rich history, was lost to Chantal Dubois. For her, the city was not a place of beauty or culture. It was a labyrinth of shadows and solitude. Chantal, 35 years old, trudged through the narrow cobblestone streets of the old town, her feet aching with each step. The shoes she wore were worn down, offering little protection against the chill seeping up from the ground. Her hair, once a warm chestnut, was now tangled and matted, hanging limply around her face. Her clothes, layers of mismatched garments scavenged from charity bins, did little to keep out the cold. She clutched them tightly around her thin frame, but the wind found its way through every gap. As she moved through the streets, the echo of her footsteps was the only sound that accompanied her. The once vibrant district, usually filled with tourists and locals alike, was now deserted. The cafes were closed, their windows dark, and the few people who passed by did so quickly, their heads down, eager to escape the freezing night. Chantal's stomach growled, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since she had last eaten. Days blurred together when you were homeless. Hunger was a constant companion. She scanned the area, eyes narrowing as she spotted a rubbish bin near the entrance of an alley. Her pride had long been eroded by the relentless grind of survival, so she didn't hesitate as she approached it, hoping to find something, anything, that would quiet the gnawing emptiness inside her. She began to sift through the bin with practiced efficiency, her hands moving quickly despite the cold. A half-eaten sandwich, a bruised apple, anything would do. But as she dug deeper, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, smooth, cold, and foreign among the usual trash. Curiosity piqued, Chantal carefully pulled out a small leather suitcase. It was remarkably well kept, almost out of place among the refuse. She glanced around, but the alley was as deserted as the streets she had just come from. Kneeling down, she set the suitcase on the ground and hesitated. The thought of what might be inside sent her heart racing, a misplaced hope that she had learned to suppress over the years. She unclasped the latches with trembling fingers and slowly lifted the lid. The sight that greeted her was beyond anything she had imagined. The suitcase was filled with money, bundles of crisp bills, neatly stacked and secured with rubber bands. The smell of the leather and the faint scent of banknotes filled her nostrils as she stared in disbelief. For a moment, the world around her seemed to pause. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness. All of it faded into the background as she grappled with the magnitude of what she had found. This money could change everything. It could buy her food, shelter, and maybe even a chance at a new life. The temptation was almost overwhelming, like a whisper in the back of her mind, urging her to take it and run. Chantal stared at the money, the temptation gnawing at her like a relentless hunger. The thought of what this fortune could buy, warmth, security, a life of comfort, swirled in her mind, intoxicating her with its possibilities. For a moment, she imagined herself walking into a shop, buying new clothes, a hot meal, maybe even a small apartment. She could escape the cold streets, live without fear or want. The idea of indulging in such luxury, of finally having control over her life, was almost too seductive to resist. Why not take it? Who would ever know? But then, a voice from deeper within her spoke louder. This was not her money. Someone, somewhere, was likely desperate to find it, just as she was desperate every day to survive. Chantal's conscience, shaped by years of hardship but never broken, began to assert itself. The idea of using this money that wasn't hers, felt wrong in a way that was impossible to ignore. She closed the suitcase slowly, her hands steadier now. The decision had been made. She couldn't keep it. She wouldn't let herself fall into the trap of easy temptation, no matter how dire her circumstances. Chantal knew that returning the suitcase would mean another night on the cold streets, another day of scrounging for food. With a sigh that sent a cloud of warm breath into the cold air, Chantal stood up, the suitcase held tightly in her hands. She walked back out of the alley, her steps purposeful, as she began the search for the suitcase's rightful owner. The streets of Lyon, lined with cobblestones that had borne witness to centuries of history, were eerily quiet as Chantal Dubois wandered aimlessly. The cold seeped through her threadbare coat, and her stomach gnawed with a hunger that had become all too familiar. She found herself drifting toward the train station, its dull lights casting long, flickering shadows on the worn bricks beneath her feet. The station was nearly deserted at this late hour. The few souls who remained hurried by, eager to escape the chill of the night. Chantal, weary from the constant battle with the elements, sank onto a bench near the waiting area, grateful for a moment's respite. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, though it did little to stave off the biting cold. As she sat there, her mind numb from fatigue, a conversation nearby caught her attention. Two men stood at a short distance, one of them speaking urgently into his phone. His voice was low, strained with worry. "I can't believe it. I lost the suitcase," he said, pacing nervously. "You know how important that money is. It was for tonight's transaction, and now I don't know what to do." Chantal's ears perked up. A suitcase full of money? She recalled the leather suitcase she had found just hours earlier, tucked away in the shadows of an alley. The very suitcase that now weighed heavily in her thoughts, locked in a silent debate between temptation and integrity. The man continued speaking, his voice now tinged with panic. "Yes, I know. I'll have to find it." Chantal felt a twinge of sympathy for the man. His desperation was palpable, a feeling she knew all too well. She watched as he ended the call, his shoulders slumped in defeat. With a deep breath, he turned and walked out of the station, disappearing into the night. Her decision was made. Chantal stood up, her body protesting against the movement, and followed the direction the man had gone. The suitcase was his. There was no doubt about it. She couldn't keep it, not after hearing the weight of his need. She found him a few streets away, his pace slow, aimless, as if the world had just collapsed around him. Chantal hesitated for a moment before calling out, her voice soft, almost unsure. "Excuse me, sir." The man turned, his eyes wide with surprise. Chantal took a cautious step forward, her fingers gripping the handle of the suitcase tightly. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. For a moment, the man simply stared, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then, his face broke into a look of profound relief. Yes, that's it," he stammered, rushing toward her. "I thought I'd lost it for good." Chantal handed over the suitcase, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and anxiety. She had done the right thing, but the thought of what she had just given up lingered in her mind. The man, now visibly calmer, looked at her with gratitude. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You don't know how much this means to me." Chantal nodded, unsure of what to say. The man seemed to study her for a moment, as if trying to read the story that her worn clothes and tired eyes told. He hesitated, then spoke again, his tone more gentle. "My name is Henry Morrow," he introduced himself. "Please let me do something to repay you. A cup of coffee, perhaps. It's the least I can do." Chantal, caught off guard by the offer, considered refusing, but something in Henry's eyes, a quiet plea for company, perhaps, made her agree. "All right," she replied. They walked together to a small cafe nearby, its warm light spilling out onto the cold street. Inside, they found a corner table where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The warmth, was a welcome contrast to the freezing night outside. Over steaming cups of coffee, Henry began to talk. He told her of his life, his wealth, and the illness that had cast a long shadow over his remaining days. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his words that spoke of loneliness and the fear of being forgotten. "My family," he said, pausing to sip his coffee. "They don't care about me. All they see is the money. Once I'm gone, they'll forget me, just as they've already done in life." Chantal listened, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel like nothing more than a burden. Henry looked at her, his expression contemplative. "I don't want to leave everything to them," he admitted. "I want it to mean something. I want it to go to someone who truly deserves it." Chantal frowned slightly, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" Henry smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "I'm proposing something unconventional, but would you consider marrying me? Not for love, but for practical reasons. You would inherit everything, and with it, you could make a difference." The cafe buzzed softly around them, the low hum of conversations blending with the gentle clinking of cups and saucers. Henry's proposal hung in the air, a surprising and weighty offer that Chantal struggled to fully comprehend. Henry watched her with a calm intensity, his eyes betraying a glimmer of hope. But Chantal, though touched by his trust, could not ignore the uncomfortable knot forming in her chest. She shook her head slowly, placing her cup down with deliberate care. "I can't," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I can't marry you, Henry. Not for money. Not for anything." Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't look away. He had expected this, perhaps even respected her more for it. "I understand," he replied, his voice quiet, almost resigned. "It was a lot to ask." Chantal reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on his. "But I can be here for you," she offered, her tone sincere. "I can stay by your side, keep you company. You don't have to go through this alone." Henry looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't about the money or the inheritance. It was about having someone who genuinely cared. "I would like that," he said, a small but genuine smile breaking the tension. "I would like that very much." Their agreement was made, unspoken but solid, as they both finished their coffee in the comforting warmth of the cafe. The following day, Chantal found herself standing in the grand foyer of Henry's apartment, an opulent space that contrasted starkly with the cold streets she had called home for so long. The ceiling was high, adorned with intricate moldings, and the walls were lined with rich, dark wood. The furniture was elegant and plush, with every detail speaking of wealth and refinement. She felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. The walls were adorned with carefully chosen art pieces, and the air was filled with the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers arranged meticulously in crystal vases. Henry led her through the rooms, each one more impressive than the last. The living room was dominated by a grand piano, its lacquered surface gleaming under the soft lights. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of a man who had once been curious, engaged with the world. Now they sat untouched, collecting dust as Henry's health had declined. Chantal could see the effort Henry had put into making his home a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the world. But she also saw the loneliness that lingered in the corners, in the untouched books, and the quiet stillness that permeated the air. As they moved from room to room, Henry watched her reaction, gauging her thoughts. "It's too much, isn't it?" he asked finally, his voice tinged with self-consciousness. Chantal paused, turning to him with a small smile. "It's different," she admitted, "but it's beautiful. It's clear you've put a lot of yourself into this place. Henry nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. It's been my refuge for many years, he said, but it's felt emptier lately. They finally reached the sitting room, where large windows overlooked the city below. The view was breathtaking, the lights of Lyon stretching out into the distance like a sea of stars. Chantal moved to the window, her gaze drawn to the beauty outside. It must be something to live with this view, she murmured. Henry joined her at the window, his eyes on the horizon. It is, he agreed. But a view is just that, something to look at. It doesn't keep you warm at night, doesn't make you feel alive. Chantal turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. You've had all this, but it hasn't made you happy, has it? Henry met her gaze, his face somber. No, it hasn't, he admitted. I thought it would once, but now I see that it's not the things you have, but the people in your life that truly matter. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. In that moment, Chantal made a silent vow to herself, to be the companion Henry needed, to help him find some semblance of peace in the days he had left. As the night drew on, Chantal felt the initial awkwardness fade away. She still felt out of place in Henry's world, but she no longer felt unwelcome. They sat together in the sitting room, the city lights flickering outside as they talked late into the night. The conversation flowed easily, with moments of shared laughter and quiet reflection. In time, the grand apartment began to feel a little less intimidating, and Henry began to feel a little less alone. Chantal's presence brought a warmth that had been missing for too long, and for the first time in years, Henry began to believe that his remaining days could be spent in peace, with someone who truly cared by his side. The sun had barely risen over the sprawling estate where Isabel lived, but the tension in the room was palpable. The luxurious surroundings, marble floors, antique furniture, and priceless artwork seemed at odds with the cold, calculating atmosphere that had settled among the family members gathered there. Isabel, Henry's older sister, sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her gaze icy. She was a woman accustomed to control, and this morning was no different. Her perfectly coiffed hair and tailored suit spoke of someone who had never had to worry about anything beyond the reach of her influence. Yet, today, there was something beyond her grasp, something that threatened the carefully maintained order of her world. "Who is she?" Isabel's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "This Chantal. Where did she come from, and why is Henry suddenly so taken with her?" Thomas, Henry's son, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was younger, with the good looks and casual arrogance of someone who'd grown up never needing to question his place in the world. But today, even he seemed uneasy. She's nobody, really. Just some homeless woman Henry picked up off the street. It's absurd. Absurd? Isabel's tone hardened. It's more than that. It's dangerous. Do you have any idea what she could be after? Juliet, Henry's daughter, who had been silently observing the conversation, finally spoke up. Her voice was softer, more uncertain, but laced with the same undercurrent of suspicion. She could be manipulating him. I mean, Dad's not in the best state of mind right now. Who knows what she's convinced him to do? Isabel's lips tightened into a thin line. Exactly. Which is why we need to act. We can't allow some vagrant to waltz in and take advantage of Henry in his condition. Thomas leaned forward, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. But what can we do? He's not exactly listening to us these days. If anything, he's been shutting us out more and more since she came along. Then we make him listen. Isabel's eyes narrowed, her mind already calculating. We remind him of who we are, his family, the ones who have been there for him, not some stranger off the streets. We'll talk to him together, make him see reason." Juliet hesitated, glancing between her mother and brother. What if he doesn't listen? What if he's already too far gone? I mean, it's clear he trusts her more than us. Isabel's expression darkened. Then we'll have to take other measures, legal measures if necessary. We'll make sure she's out of the picture before she can do any real damage. The room fell silent, the weight of Isabel's words hanging in the air. Thomas and Juliet exchanged uneasy glances, the implications of their mother's plan sinking in. It was one thing to be suspicious, but to take action against their own father's wishes. It was a line neither of them had expected to cross. But Isabel was unyielding. She had spent her life protecting the family's wealth and reputation, and she wasn't about to let everything crumble because of some nameless woman. Her eyes flashed with a resolve that brooked no argument. "We do what we have to do, for the sake of the family." The conversation ended there, but the tension remained. Each of them knew that the coming days would bring confrontation and, with it, the risk of tearing their family apart. But for Isabel, there was no other choice. She had built her life around control, and she would not let that control slip now, not when so much was at stake. Meanwhile, in Henry's apartment, the atmosphere was starkly different. Chantal, unaware of the storm brewing against her, was beginning to settle into her new role. She had started to understand the rhythms of Henry's life, his needs, his moods, and though the opulence of her surroundings still felt foreign, she found herself growing more comfortable, even finding moments of genuine connection with the man she had agreed to help. But the quiet trust developing between them was fragile, and as the days passed, Chantal sensed a growing distance in Henry's gaze, a shadow of something unspoken. She didn't know it yet, but that shadow was the doubt his family had sown, doubt that threatened to unravel everything they had begun to build together. And as Isabel, Thomas, and Juliet prepared to confront Henry, the stage was set for a battle not just over wealth, but over trust, loyalty, and the very bonds that held the family together. The late afternoon light filtered softly through the tall windows of Henry's apartment, casting a warm glow over the room where Henry and Chantal sat. The space, once dominated by silence and solitude, was now filled with the low hum of conversation and the rustle of papers. A large wooden table, temporarily repurposed as a workspace, was strewn with documents, blueprints, and plans for a future neither of them had imagined just weeks before. Henry leaned back in his chair, his frail fingers tracing the edge of a sheet of paper. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful, "about what I want to leave behind. Not just for my family, but for the world. Something meaningful." Chantal looked up from the notes she had been reviewing, meeting his gaze. "The foundation," she said, already knowing where his thoughts were leading. "You want to start with that." Henry nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Yes. A foundation for those who need it most. People like you. Like how you were before we met." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've spent so much of my life accumulating wealth, but now it feels empty. What's the point if it doesn't do any good?" Chantal set her pen down, folding her hands in her lap. She had never imagined herself in a position like this, planning a charity, discussing the future with a man who was once a stranger to her. But now it felt natural, as if this was what she had been meant to do all along. "We can help so many people, Henry. There are so many out there who are forgotten, like I was. We can give them hope, a chance to rebuild their lives." Henry's eyes softened as he listened to her. "You've shown me what that hope looks like, Chantal. You've given me a reason to believe that change is possible. even at this stage in my life. Their conversations over the past days had become more than just discussions about logistics or funding. They were sharing their visions, their hopes, and their fears. Each day, as they pored over the details of the foundation, they grew closer, their bond deepening in ways that neither had anticipated. It was a connection born not just out of gratitude, but out of mutual respect and a shared sense of purpose. The foundation they were building wasn't just about charity, it was about creating a legacy, something that would endure long. The idea of focusing on the forgotten areas of Lyon, the very places where Chantal had once struggled, brought a sense of fulfillment to both of them. For Henry, it was a way to find peace in his final days, to ensure that his life had meant something beyond wealth and status. For Chantal, it was an opportunity to give back, to use her experiences to guide others toward a better future. Outside the apartment, the city of Lyon carried on, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place within those walls. The foundation was still in its infancy, but it had already begun to take shape, drawing from the experiences and insights that both Henry and Chantal brought to the table. They worked in tandem, each balancing the other, each contributing to a vision that was as much about redemption as it was about charity. But as they built this new chapter of their lives together, the tension with Henry's family simmered just beneath the surface. Unseen, but felt, their disapproval loomed over every decision, every plan. Henry knew it. Chantal sensed it, but neither spoke of it directly. There was too much at stake, too much they wanted to accomplish before time ran out. The days had grown longer and darker in Henry's apartment, the once lively space now overshadowed by the relentless advance of his illness. Chantal could feel it in the air, the way the light seemed to dim even in the brightest part of the day, the way Henry's laughter, once a constant companion, had become infrequent and strained. His condition was worsening, and there was little she could do to stop it. Chantal had never been one to dwell on helplessness, but as she watched Henry struggle with the simple act of getting out of bed, she felt it gnawing at her. He was a man who had faced the world with strength and dignity, and now that same world was taking its toll on him, piece by piece. Each day he seemed a little weaker, his breath a little more labored, his eyes a little more clouded with pain. The doctors had spoken in hushed tones, their prognosis bleak. The options were few, the chances slim. They mentioned the possibility of a bone marrow transplant, but Henry had dismissed it. But Chantal couldn't accept that. She couldn't just stand by and watch him fade away. She had seen enough loss in her life, enough suffering, and she refused to let Henry be another casualty of a world that so often took more than it gave. The idea had taken root one night as she sat by his bedside watching him sleep. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a reminder of how fragile life could be. She thought about the transplant, about the slim chance it offered, and about how Henry had dismissed it without giving her a say. That was when she decided she wouldn't let him make that choice for her. The next morning, after Henry had fallen asleep again, Chantal slipped out of the apartment. The streets of Lyon were quiet in the early hours, the city still waking up. She made her way to the hospital, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She knew what she was about to do was risky, but the thought of losing Henry was unbearable. At the hospital, Chantal approached the reception desk, her voice steady as she inquired about the bone marrow test. The nurse looked at her with a mix of sympathy and curiosity, but didn't question her motives. Chantal filled out the forms, the pen feeling heavy in her hand as she wrote her name and signed the consent. The test itself was quick, just a simple blood draw, but the implications weighed heavily on her. As the nurse bandaged her arm, Chantal couldn't help but wonder what Henry would say if he knew. Would he be angry? Would he try to talk her out of it? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the possibility that she could help him, that she could be the one to save him. The waiting was the hardest part. Chantal returned to the apartment, going about her day as if nothing had changed. But inside, she was a storm of nerves and anticipation. She watched Henry closely, each of his winces and pained breaths a reminder of why she had made this decision. But she kept it to herself, not wanting to give him false hope, or worse, to burden him with the knowledge of what she had done. As the days passed, Henry's condition continued to deteriorate. Chantal found herself spending more and more time by his side, holding his hand, reading to him, trying to distract him from the pain. Finally, the call came. Chantal excused herself and stepped into the hallway, her heart racing as she answered. The nurse's voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the words she spoke felt like a lifeline. Chantal was a match. She leaned against the wall, her legs weak with relief. The chances had been slim, but it had worked. She had a chance to save him, to give him the time he needed, but the relief was short-lived, replaced by the realization of what she had to do next. She would have to tell Henry, to convince him to go through with the transplant, to trust her judgment even if it meant putting her at risk. It wouldn't be easy. Henry was stubborn, and his pride often got in the way. But Chantal knew that she couldn't keep this from him any longer. As she walked back into the apartment, Chantal felt a renewed sense of purpose. Henry was dozing in his chair, his face pale but peaceful. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. He stirred, opening his eyes, and smiled weakly when he saw her. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Henry's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it?" Chantal took a deep breath, squeezing his hand. "I went to the hospital. I got tested. I'm a match, Henry. I can do this. We can do this." For a moment, there was silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Henry's eyes searched hers, and she could see the conflict there, the desire to protect her, to refuse, warring with the hope she had just given him. Finally, he nodded, a single slow movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." The operating room was sterile, a world of cold steel and bright, unyielding light. Machines hummed, their rhythmic beeping a stark contrast to the tension that filled the space. Chantal lay on the operating table, her heart racing as the anesthetic began to take effect. She had spent countless hours by Henry's side, but now she was the one lying beneath the surgical lights, about to undergo a procedure that would determine both their fates. The surgeons moved with practiced efficiency, their faces masked, their hands steady. They had done this many times before, but the gravity of this particular case was not lost on them. It wasn't just about the medical procedure. It was about the bond between the two people lying on those tables, one fighting to give life, the other fighting to hold on to it. As Chantal slipped into unconsciousness, her last thoughts were of Henry, of the life they had tried to build together, and of the uncertainty that lay ahead. The process of harvesting the bone marrow was delicate, the surgeons working carefully to extract the cells from Chantal's hip. The marrow, rich with the potential for new life, was collected and prepared for transplant. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Henry was prepped for his own part of the procedure. Henry's body was frail, weakened by months of illness and the toll it had taken on him. As the surgeons worked to clear his system and prepare it to accept the new marrow, there was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the risks. Henry's condition made everything more precarious. His immune system was almost non-existent, and the procedure could just as easily push him over the edge as it could save him. The transplant itself was both simple and complex. The marrow, once ready, was infused into Henry's bloodstream, where it would hopefully begin the process of rebuilding his body from the inside out. It was a race against time, whether the new cells would take hold and begin to grow before his body succumbed to the strain of the surgery and the disease. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew palpable. Henry remained unconscious, his vital signs fluctuating, the machines around him beeping erratically at times, sending spikes of anxiety through the medical team. Chantal, in another room, was still under the effects of the anesthesia, her body recovering from the invasive procedure. The surgeons and nurses monitored both patients closely, aware that any misstep could have devastating consequences. By the time Chantal was wheeled into the recovery room, the initial phase of the transplant was complete. She was pale, her body bruised and sore, but stable. The doctors had done everything they could, and now all that was left was to wait. Chantal drifted in and out of consciousness, each moment of wakefulness tinged with pain and disorientation. But even in her weakened state, her thoughts were of Henry, of whether he was still fighting, whether the marrow she had given was enough to save him. Hours turned into a day, and the waiting continued. Henry's condition remained critical, his body struggling to accept the new cells. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with worry as they reviewed his charts and adjusted his medications. It was a precarious balance. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and everything they had worked for could be lost. Chantal, too, was on the edge. The physical toll of the surgery was significant, her body weakened by the process of donation. But even as she lay in her hospital bed, connected to her own set of machines, she refused to let go of the hope that had driven her to this point. She had given everything she had, and now it was up to Henry's body to do the rest. The night passed slowly, the hospital quiet save for the hum of the machines and the soft footsteps of the nurses making their rounds. Chantal and Henry, separated by walls and equipment, both fought their battles in silence, their fates intertwined in a way that few could understand. As dawn approached, the first signs of change began to appear. Henry's vitals stabilized, the erratic beeping of the monitors giving way to a steadier rhythm. It was still too soon to say whether the transplant would be a success, but for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. Chantal, barely awake, heard the news from a nurse, her heart lifting even as her body screamed with exhaustion. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek, a mixture of relief and fear for what was still to come. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the first sound Henry heard as he slowly emerged from the fog of unconsciousness. His eyelids felt heavy, as though they had been weighed down by lead. But with effort, he managed to open them, squinting against the harsh fluorescent light that filled the hospital room. The world came into focus slowly, the sterile white walls, the IV drip beside him, and finally, the figure seated at his bedside. Chantal was there, just as she had been every day since his surgery. Her face, etched with worry and fatigue, brightened as she saw his eyes flutter open. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but steady. "Henry, you're awake." Henry tried to respond, but his throat was dry, the words catching in his mouth. Chantal quickly reached for a cup of water, holding it to his lips as he sipped, the cool liquid soothing the parched skin. He managed a weak smile, grateful for her presence, for the unwavering support she had shown him through everything. "Chantal," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You stayed." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I told you I would. I'm not going anywhere." Henry's mind, though still clouded by the remnants of the coma, slowly began to clear. He remembered the surgery, the last desperate attempt to buy more time, and the overwhelming sense of uncertainty that had accompanied it. But now, as he lay there, weakened but alive, he knew there was something he had to do, something he had to say before it was too late. "Where's the lawyer?" Henry asked, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "I need to see him." Chantal hesitated, her expression softening. "Henry, you've been through so much. You should rest." But Henry shook his head, the movement slow but resolute. "No, this can't wait. I need to make sure everything is in place." It wasn't long before the lawyer arrived, a tall, somber man who had handled Henry's affairs for years. He entered the room quietly, his presence professional and unobtrusive. Chantal stood to the side as Henry gestured for the lawyer to come closer. "I'm changing my will," Henry said, his voice firm despite his frailty. I'm leaving everything to Chantal. The apartment, the money, the assets, everything." The lawyer's pen hovered over his notepad, but before he could respond, the door burst open. Isabel, followed closely by Thomas and Juliet, stormed into the room, their faces twisted with anger and disbelief. "Henry, what are you doing?" Isabel's voice was sharp, her eyes blazing as she looked from her brother to Chantal. "You can't do this. This woman has manipulated you, taken advantage of you in your weakest moments. We won't allow it." Henry's expression hardened, a flash of the man he had once been. "You don't have a say in this, Isabel. This is my decision, and it's final." Thomas stepped forward, his tone desperate. "Dad, please think about what you're doing. You can't just give everything away to a stranger. We're your family." But Henry was unmoved. He turned his gaze to Chantal, who had remained silent through the confrontation, her face calm but her eyes filled with pain. "She's not a stranger," Henry said quietly. "She's the only one who's been here, who's cared for me without expecting anything in return. She's the one I trust." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of Henry's words hanging heavy in the air. Isabel's face tightened with fury, but she said nothing, her mouth a thin line of suppressed rage. Juliet, usually more reserved, looked as though she wanted to speak, but she, too, remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Henry's breathing became more labored, the exertion of speaking taking its toll on his weakened body. The lawyer, sensing the need for urgency, stepped forward. "Mr. Morrow, if you're certain about this, we can finalize the changes now." Henry nodded, his gaze never wavering. "Do it." As the lawyer made the necessary adjustments, Chantal stood beside Henry, her hand resting gently on his arm. She could feel the tremors running through him, the strain it took for him to assert his will against his family's opposition. But she also felt the strength of his resolve, the certainty that this was the right thing to do. When it was done, the lawyer left the room, and the tension that had filled the space seemed to ebb slightly. Isabel, Thomas, and Juliet stood together, a united front of silent discontent, but they knew there was nothing more they could do. Henry's decision was final, and they would have to live with it. As they left the room, Henry turned to Chantal, his eyes tired but clear. "Promise me," he said softly. "Promise me you'll continue the work we started. The charity, the people we've helped. Don't let it end with me." Chantal's throat tightened, but she nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "I promise, Henry. I won't let you down." Henry closed his eyes, a look of peace settling over his features. He had done what he needed to do, and now all that was left was to rest. Chantal remained at his side, her hand still on his arm, knowing that whatever came next, she would honor the promise she had made. She would carry on the work they had begun together, ensuring that Henry's legacy lived on, not just in wealth, but in the lives they had touched. The days after the surgery were a blur of sterile hospital lights and hushed conversations. The bone marrow transplant had been a success, technically speaking. The doctors had done everything they could, and by all accounts, the procedure had gone as planned. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the success on paper hadn't translated into the miracle they'd hoped for. Henry's condition remained unchanged. His body, weakened by the fight, simply refused to recover. Chantal sat by his bedside, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. There were no more words of reassurance left to offer. They both knew what was coming, and there was a strange kind of peace in that shared understanding. Henry's breaths were shallow, each one a visible effort, but his eyes still held that familiar glint of determination. He looked at Chantal, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I guess this is it," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We did what we could." Chantal nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You fought hard, Henry, harder than anyone could have asked." He chuckled weakly, the sound fading into a cough. Not hard enough, apparently. But there was no bitterness in his tone, only acceptance. "It's all right, though. I've made my peace with it." Chantal squeezed his hand, her own resolve hardening. "I'll make sure everything we started continues. The charity, the people we've helped. It won't end with you." Henry's smile widened, though it was tinged with sadness. "I know you will. That's why I chose you." For a moment they simply looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Then, as if the effort had been too much, Henry closed his eyes, his grip on her hand loosening. Chantal didn't let go, not even when his breathing slowed to a stop, and the steady beep of the heart monitor flattened into a single, unending tone. The apartment felt different without him. The warmth and life that Henry had brought to the space were gone, leaving behind only the cold, empty shell of what had once been a home. The echoes of their conversations still lingered in the rooms, but now they were just memories, unable to fill the void his absence had left. Chantal walked through the apartment, her footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. There was too much at stake. The charity was growing, and the work they had started together was more important now than ever. But Henry's family had other ideas. Isabel, Thomas, and Juliet descended upon the apartment like vultures, their grief quickly giving way to anger and resentment. They had been denied what they believed was rightfully theirs, and they weren't about to let that go quietly. "This was supposed to be ours," Isabel spat one afternoon, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "You had no right to take everything from us." Chantal stood her ground, her expression calm but resolute. Henry made his decision. He wanted the money to go where it would do the most good. "I'm just following his wishes." Thomas scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "His wishes? Or yours? You've manipulated him from the start, and now you think you can just waltz in here and take what belongs to this family?" Juliet, usually the quieter of the three, spoke up, her voice tinged with frustration. "You might have his money, but you'll never be part of this family. You're nothing but an outsider." The words stung, but Chantal refused to let them shake her. "I'm not trying to be part of your family," she said evenly. "I'm here to do what Henry asked me to do, and that's exactly what I'm going to keep doing." Isabel's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. The three of them eventually left, but Chantal knew they wouldn't give up easily. The hostility and the threats would continue, but she was prepared. She had made a promise to Henry, and no amount of bitterness or anger from his family would deter her from fulfilling it. As she sat alone in the now quiet apartment, Chantal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had faced worse, and with Henry's memory as her guide, she knew she would find the strength to keep going. The charity would thrive, and Henry's legacy would live on, through her, and through the work they had begun together. The grand hall was filled with a warm, golden light, reflecting off the polished marble floors and high, arched ceilings. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet anticipation as the crowd settled into their seats, their voices a soft hum of conversation. Tonight was a celebration, a testament to the charity's growth and the lives it had touched across Lyon. The event had drawn people from all walks of life, those who had benefited from the charity's work, and those who had supported it from the beginning. Chantal stood at the back of the hall, taking it all in. The journey to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges, but seeing the faces of those gathered here, the people whose lives had been changed, filled her with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had made a promise to Henry, and tonight was proof that she had kept it. As the lights dimmed and the crowd fell silent, Chantal made her way to the podium. Her steps were measured, her heart steady. She had rehearsed her speech 100 times, but now, standing before these people, she realized that words alone could never fully capture what this night meant, not just to her, but to everyone who had been a part of this journey. "Thank you all for being here," Chantal began, her voice carrying across the hall. "Tonight is not just a celebration of the work we've done, but a tribute to the man who made it all possible." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the crowd, seeing faces she recognized, beneficiaries, volunteers, supporters, and, in the back, the family that had fought so hard against her and Henry's vision. Their presence was a reminder of the obstacles they had overcome, but tonight their disapproval was irrelevant. Henry Morrow, she continued, was a man who believed in the power of compassion, in the importance of giving back to the community that shaped him. He understood that wealth is meaningless if it isn't used to make a difference, to help those who have been overlooked. Chantal reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was the letter Henry had left her, his final words of encouragement and gratitude, a letter she had read countless times but had never shared publicly, until now. "In his last days, Henry wrote me a letter," she said, unfolding the paper carefully. "He asked me to continue the work we started together, to ensure that the charity would not only survive, but thrive, long after he was gone. Tonight, I want to share his words with you, because they belong to all of us." Chantal's voice was steady as she read the letter aloud, each word a reflection of Henry's unwavering commitment to the cause they had built together. The room was silent, the audience captivated by the sincerity and emotion in her voice. "Chantal," she read, "you have been more than a partner in this endeavor. You have been my friend, my confidant, and the person who gave me hope when I had none left. I leave this world knowing that the charity is in the best possible hands. You have the strength, the courage, and the heart to carry this legacy forward. Never doubt that you are capable of great things. Continue this work and know that you have my eternal gratitude." Chantal folded the letter and placed it back in her pocket, the weight of Henry's words settling over her like a warm embrace. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces that now seemed to glow with a shared sense of purpose. "This charity is not just Henry's legacy," she said, her voice strong. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together, when we put aside our differences and work toward a common goal. It's a symbol of what kindness and integrity can build. The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the hall with a sound that seemed to resonate in every corner. But Chantal remained composed, her focus not on the accolades, but on the future, the work that still needed to be done, the lives that still needed to be touched. As the applause died down, she stepped away from the podium, her heart lightened by the knowledge that Henry's legacy was secure, that the charity would continue to grow, helping those who needed it most. She had kept her promise, and in doing so had found her own place in the world, one defined not by wealth or power, but by the quiet strength of knowing she had made a difference. And as she walked through the hall, greeted by grateful smiles and warm handshakes, Chantal knew that this was only the beginning. Henry's legacy would live on, not just in the charity, but in the hearts of everyone it had touched, and in her own journey, which was far from over. And that, my friends, is the powerful story of Henry and Chantal, a tale of unlikely partnerships, resilience, and the incredible impact of compassion. It's a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful legacies are built not on wealth, but on the kindness we show to others. If this story moved you as much as it did me, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the good we can bring into the world. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay inspired, and remember, small acts of kindness can lead to big changes. See you in the next video.